Good evening. This evening I'm going to continue on with my reading from Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung. And I'm reading from paragraphs 22 to 25. I'm calling this the real-world problem because this is a phrase that Dr. Jung uses in this particular part of the book. And let me set up my Facebook so I can see the chat. That's better. Okay, there we are. All right. So in chapter 22, first of all, Dr. Jung, I'm going to go through these paragraphs first, just hitting a couple of high points before I read them. So, first of all, in chapter 22, Dr. Jung is very insistent that the Christ symbol is very important for humanity because it is highly developed in our thinking. And he also points out that the same is true of the figure of Buddha, and therefore we understand something from that. And so then some other high points here. He points out that the Christian symbol is one-sided, and therefore it creates a very serious problem for humanity as a whole, and that's a big issue. And in a way, it's almost inevitable. He talks about probabilismus, which is a way of dealing with your sins, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. But the fundamental thing that he's talking about here is that the self is an unfathomable union of good and evil. And the problem with the Christian symbol is that it doesn't make room for evil per se in his way of thinking about things. And so I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think about that. All right, so let me read on. The Christ symbol is of the greatest importance for psychology insofar as it is perhaps the most highly developed and differentiated symbol of the self, apart from the figure of the Buddha. We can see this from the scope and substance of all the pronouncements that have been made about Christ. They agree with the psychological phenomenology of the self in an unusually high degree, although they do not include all aspects of this archetype. Now, Dr. Jung is talking about the deepest archetype in the unconscious being the self, or what he calls the God image. And in another book, in Ion, he talks in great detail about Christ being a symbol of this deepest archetype in every human being. So I'm reading from Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung, paragraphs 22 to 25. I'm in the middle of paragraph 22. The almost limitless range of the self might be deemed a disadvantage as compared with the definiteness of the religious figure, but it is by no means the task of science to pass value judgments. Not only is the self indefinite, but paradoxically enough, it also includes the quality of definiteness and even of uniqueness. This is probably one of the reasons why precisely those religions founded by historical person this is probably why one of the reasons why precisely those religions founded by historical personages have become world religions, such as Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam. The inclusion in a religion of a unique human personality, especially when conjoined to an indeterminable divine nature, is consistent with the absolute individuality of the self, which combines uniqueness with eternity and the individual with universal. The self is a union of opposites par excellence, and this is where it differs essentially from the Christ symbol. The androgyny of Christ is the utmost concession the Church has made to the problem of opposites. I think what he's referring to here is the fact that the Christ symbol as practiced in many churches is entirely masculine, and when he says the androgyny of Christ, he's suggesting that Christ is both masculine and feminine. The opposition between light and good on the one hand and darkness and evil on the other is left in a state of open conflict, since Christ simply represents good and his counterpart, the devil, evil. This opposition is the real world problem. This opposition is the real world problem, which at present is still unsolved. The self, however, is absolutely paradoxical in that it represents in every respect thesis and antithesis, and at the same time synthesis. Psychological proofs of this assertion abound, though it is impossible for me to quote them here in extenso. I would refer the knowledgeable reader to the symbolism of the mandala. Let me just check one thing here. Okay. Well, I just ask you to imagine in your mind the image of the yin-yang symbol as an example. Paragraph 23. Once the exploration of the unconscious has led the conscious mind to an experience of the archetype, the individual is confronted with the abysmal contradictions of human nature. And this confrontation in turn leads to the possibility of a direct experience of light and darkness, of Christ and the devil. For better or worse, there is only a bare possibility of this and not a guarantee. For experiences of this kind cannot of necessity be induced by any human means. There are factors to be considered which are not under our control. Experience of the opposites has nothing whatever to do with intellectual insight or with empathy. It is more what we would call fate. Such an experience can convince one person of the truth of Christ, another of the truth of the Buddha, to the exclusion of all other evidence. Paragraph 24. With the experience of the opposites, there is no experience of wholeness, and hence no inner approach to the sacred figures. I'm sorry, I misread this. I'll read it once more. Paragraph 24. Without without the experience of the opposites. There is no experience of wholeness, and hence no inner approach to the sacred figures. So this means to me that if you think of yourself as a good person, if you don't experience yourself also as a bad person, then you haven't had the experience of the opposites, because the experience of the opposites requires you to have the experience of yourself as both good and bad. For this reason, Christianity rightly insists on sinfulness and original sin with the obvious intent of opening up the abyss of universal opposition in every individual, at least from the outside. But this method is bound to break down in the case of a moderately alert intellect. But this method is bound to break down in the case of a moderately alert intellect. Dogma is then simply no longer believed, and on top of that is thought absurd. So what he's saying here is that Christianity opens up the opposites, but then doesn't solve them. Okay, so I'll read this once again. For this reason, Christianity rightly insists on sinfulness and original sin with the obvious intent of opening up the abyss of universal opposition in every individual, at least from the outside. But this method is bound to break down in the case of a moderately alert intellect. Dogma is simply then no longer believed, and on top of that is thought absurd. Such an intellect is merely one-sided and sticks at the ineptia mystery, which means that intellect is unable to understand the mystery. It is miles from Tertullian's antinomies. So an antinomy is a duality. And remember from yesterday's reading, Tertullian was the fellow that said that Christ rose from the dead. And of course that's true because it's impossible. So in fact, it is quite incapable of enduring the suffering such a tension involves. Cases are not unknown where the rigorous exercises and proselytizings of the Catholics and a certain type of Protestant education that is always sniffing out sin have brought about psychic damage that leads not to the kingdom of heaven, but to the consulting room of the doctor. So what he's saying is that if you're being blamed for sin all the time, it may cause a neurosis and you end up with a psychoanalyst. Although insight into the problem of opposites is absolutely imperative, there are very few people who can stand it in practice, in a fact which has not escaped the notice of the confessional. So, in other words, recognizing that you have a bad part is very difficult to accept. And this is why people guilt trip, why they try to hive off their guilt on someone else. And we see an excellent example of this in our current affairs. So Dr. Jung is being forgiving of that trait because it's hard to cope with. Although insight into the problem of opposites is absolutely imperative, there are very few people who can stand it in practice, a fact which has not escaped the notice of the confessional. By way of a reaction to this, we have the palliative of moral probabilism, a doctrine that has suffered frequent attack from all corners because it tries to mitigate the crushing effect of sin. Now, he has a footnote here, so I will read the footnote because it defines probabilism. So, Zuckler defines it as follows. Probabilism is the name generally given to that way of thinking which is content to answer scientific questions with a greater or lesser degree of probability. The moral probabilism, with which alone we are concerned here, consists of the principle that acts of ethical self-determination are to be guided not by conscience, but according to what is probably right, i.e., according to whatever has been recommended by any representative or doctrinal authority. The Jesuit probabilist Escobar, who died in 1669, was, for instance, of the opinion that if a penitent should plead a probable opinion as the motive for his action, the father confessor would be obliged to absolve him, even if he were not of the same opinion. Escobar quotes a number of Jesuit authorities on the question of how often one is bound to love God in a lifetime. According to one opinion, loving God once shortly before death is sufficient. Another says once a year or even every 3 or 4 years. He himself comes to the conclusion that it is sufficient to love God once at the first awakening of reason, and then once every 5 years, and finally once in the hour of death. In his opinion, the large number of different moral doctrines forms one of the main proofs of God's kindly providence, because they make the yoke of Christ so light. So what he's saying is that if you're in confession and you confess to a murder, as long as you've loved God once in your life, then God is going to forgive your sin. And also the idea that if you break one of the 10 Commandments, if it's probable that it was appropriate, then it's okay. So I call that a get out of jail free card. Whatever one may think of this phenomenon, one thing is certain. Whatever one may think of this phenomenon, one thing is certain, that apart from anything else, it holds within it a large humanity and an understanding of human weakness, which compensate for the world's unbearable antinomies. The tremendous paradox implicit in the insistence on original sin on the one hand, and the concession made by probabilism on the other, is, for the psychologist, a necessary consequence of the Christian problem of opposites outlined above. For in the self, good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins. So in other words, good and evil are both in the self. They're closer than identical twins. The reality of evil and its incompatibility with good cleave the opposites asunder and lead inexorably to the crucifixion and suspension of everything that lives. Since the soul is by nature Christian, this result is bound to come as infallibly as it is. Since the soul is by nature Christian, this result is bound to come as infallibly as it did in the life of Christ. We all have to be crucified with Christ, i.e., suspended in a moral suffering equivalent to veritable crucifixion. Suspended in a moral suffering equivalent to moral crucifixion. In practice, this is only possible up to a point, and apart from that is so unbearable and inimical to life that the ordinary human being can afford to get into such a state only occasionally, in fact, as seldom as possible. For how could he remain ordinary in face of such suffering? A more or less probabilistic attitude to the problem of evil is therefore unavoidable. Hence, the truth about the self, the unfathomable union of good and evil, comes out concretely in the paradox that although sin is the gravest and most pernicious thing there comes out most concretely in the paradox that although sin is the gravest and most pernicious thing there is, it is still not so serious that it cannot be disposed of with probabilist arguments. Nor is this necessarily a lax or frivolous proceeding, but simply a practical necessity of life. The confessional proceeds like life itself, which successfully struggles against being engulfed in an irreconcilable contradiction. Note that at the same time the conflict remains in full force, as is once more consistent with the antinomial character of the self, which is itself both conflict and unity. Christianity, paragraph 25. Christianity has made the antinomy of good and evil into a world problem and, by formulating the conflict dogmatically, raised it to an absolute principle. Into this as yet unresolved conflict, the Christian is cast as a protagonist of good, a fellow player in the world drama. Understood in its deepest sense, being Christ's follower involves a suffering that is unendurable to the great majority of mankind. Consequently, the example of Christ is in reality followed either with reservation or not at all, and the pastoral practice of the church even finds itself obliged to lighten the yoke of Christ. This means a pretty considerable reduction in the severity and harshness of the conflict, and hence in practice a relativism of good and evil. Good is equivalent to the unconditional imitation of Christ, and evil is its hindrance. Man's moral weakness and sloth are what chiefly hinder the imitation, and it is to these that probabilism extends a practical understanding, which may sometimes, perhaps, come nearer to Christian tolerance, mildness, and love of one's neighbor than the attitude of those who see in probabilism a mere laxity. Although one must concede a number of cardinal Christian virtues in the probabilistic endeavor, one must still not overlook the fact that it obviates much of the suffering involved in the imitation of Christ, and that the conflict of good and evil is thus robbed of its harshness and toned down to tolerable proportions. This brings about an approach to the psychic archetype of the self, where even these opposites seem to be united, though, as I say, it differs from the Christian symbolism, which leaves the conflict open. For the latter, there is a rift running through the world. Light wars against night, and the upper against the lower. The two are not one as they are in the psychic archetype. But even though religious dogma may condemn the idea of two being one, religious practice does, as we have seen, allow the natural psychological symbol of the self at one with itself, an approximate means of expression. Okay, so I'm going to discontinue this reading at this point. I'll read on about this tomorrow, ideally, okay, with the seed of unity. So Christianity offers the seed of unity, but it isn't giving us unity. And so I'll discontinue reading for today. Unless you have any comments or questions, I'll be happy to take them now. Otherwise, I'm going to move on and wish you a pleasant Saturday evening. Okay, so good night. I'm going to discontinue for today. Thank you for joining me today.